Okay, this week we're going to be covering different kinds of study designs that you can use to try and answer the research questions that you've developed. Now, this is of course not going to be an exhaustive list of the varying kinds of study designs and templates that you can use to address different research questions. Of course, as part of an undergraduate research project, we've tried to limit the number of study designs that you can choose from to try and make it a little bit more manageable for you. And we've selected study designs that are, at least in some regard, feasible for you to do as an undergraduate research project. So what I want to do in this session is go through each of the study designs and give you a little bit of a description of them. Of course, there's further details in the assessment brief, so make sure that you read that in detail. So, you've seen the figure on the assessment brief and on the SOLPET page for the assessments tab, but we're going to go through it bit by bit and look at each of the different kinds of study designs that we can approach. So, to start off with, we can break our study designs broadly into two different categories. We can either look at empirical research, which is where we actually look at the individually observed data that we collect as part of our studies. So we may go out and actually conduct observations ourselves, measurements, talk to people, get their responses, observe behaviours, measure things in the lab, so on and so forth. Or we may use existing data sets that have already done this. So we would call these secondary empirical projects. If we collect the data ourselves, they are a primary empirical research project. If there is already existing data that we can potentially utilise to answer our questions, then that would be a secondary research project, secondary empirical research project. But we also have another kind of secondary project, which is a literature review. So whereas a secondary empirical research project actually accesses the data and uses the individual observations that are made, it accesses the raw data itself. In a literature review, instead, we typically utilise the results of studies in a secondary fashion. So there will be existing primary research studies and potentially secondary research studies that have accessed individual data, conducted analyses on them, interpreted them, and presented their results in publications, in journals. With a literature review, what we do is we go about searching the literature, trying to identify relevant studies that present results that may help us answer our research question, and then we attempt to synthesize those results. So instead of acting on the data itself, we use the study's results as the data in our literature review. Now I should say, there are some literature review approaches that do what are called participant level analyses, but this is not something that you'll be doing as part of a undergraduate research project. These sorts of projects require a lot of work, as you have to get in contact with all of the individual study authors, ask them to share their original data, and then you bring in all the data from these various studies and conduct an overall analysis on the raw data itself, as opposed to on attempting to synthesize the results of those studies. So let's start off with the literature reviews then and just look at the two different kinds that you can consider. So to start off with any literature review that you would potentially conduct, you should consider taking a systematic approach to it. That's not to say that all reviews that you will come across will be systematic reviews, but if you select to do a secondary project such as a literature review for your research project that you're proposing, then you will have to follow a systematic approach. So with a systematic review, obviously we identify the varying studies out there and we use a systematic process where we define the search criteria that we're going to use, where we're going to search for the literature, and then we also apply screening criteria, including inclusion and exclusion criteria, and we try and design our methods in such a way that we will identify and include all the relevant studies to help answer our research question. So we've spoke about the PICO before, which is your participant, intervention, comparator and outcome template that you can use to try and think about studies. So for example, if you wanted to conduct a systematic review on the effects of a particular intervention in comparison to, say, a placebo or a control on a certain kind of outcome in a certain kind of population, then you would specify that you want to search for and include studies that include the population that you're interested in, examine the intervention that you're interested in, compare it to the comparators such as a placebo or control that you're interested in, and measure the outcomes that you're interested in. You may also add other criteria such as specifying the study design, including some of the ones we've identified here. So it may be you only want to look at observational or experimental studies, or you're happy to include and synthesize both of them. But these are decisions you need to make when you're defining your systematic search criteria and methods. Now, once you've done your systematic review, then there are two approaches to your review type project that you can use to synthesize the results of the studies that you've identified. You can start off with a qualitative narrative synthesis if you want. Now, in this case, you look at the varying studies in your systematic review and you apply a kind of critical analysis approach to looking at the results, considering the methods that each individual study has used, and trying to explain the pattern of results across those studies. There are varying frameworks that you can use to consider conducting a narrative synthesis, and I will include some older lectures that were recorded a couple of years ago at the beginning of the pandemic, when all students ended up having to do a review-based project because they were unable to get into the labs and conduct empirical projects. And in that, there's a lot more details about the different kinds of narrative syntheses that you can approach, and there's varying resources that are cited in there that you can follow through and take a look at. But you may also want to consider whether or not it's appropriate to do a quantitative synthesis, otherwise known as a meta-analysis, where you quantitatively, statistically analyse the results of the studies. And these are typically presented in what are called forest plots. So this is actually a very famous forest plot. This is the forest plot from the Cochrane Collaboration's logo. And each of the individual horizontal lines on the logo represent the results from an individual study, and the diamond at the bottom of it represents the overall statistical synthesis of those results. And in fact, this is actually a very famous one. It reflects the it shows the results from a systematic review and meta-analysis of the effects of corticosteroids on women who are about to give birth prematurely and their effects on newborn child's mortality rate. This was one of the very early systematic reviews that was part of the Cochrane Collaboration's formation, and the Cochrane Collaboration are a large organisation that are involved in systematic evidence synthesis to impact healthcare decision making. They influence large organisations such as the World Health Organization and have a very big impact on healthcare around the world. Now, obviously these are the kinds of secondary projects you can do as literature reviews, but you also have different kinds of empirical projects, as we've noted, and many students choose to do an empirical project. So we can break our empirical projects down into two categories. They can either be observational or experimental. So what do we mean by observational or experimental studies? Well, within an observational study, the name pretty much explains what we do. We observe. We collect data, and that's it. We don't try to actively intervene on the population that we're interested in studying. All we do is we measure things, we draw observations, and we collate that data, and then we either look at relationships in it, or we try to describe it, or we look at differences perhaps between groups, but we don't actually actively do anything to the participants other than observe them. Within an experimental study, contrastingly, we actually try to intervene. We actually try to deliver some sort of intervention, some sort of exposure that would allow us to then try to determine what the effects of doing that actually are. Now, that's not to say that an observational study can't look at the effects of an intervention. It's just that we don't actually do it ourselves. So in an observational study, you may wish to know about the effects of physical activity upon blood pressure, for example. And so what you might do in an observational context is you might collect data on how active people are. You just merely observe how active they are. Maybe they do a questionnaire, maybe you collect some accelerometer data, maybe you count their steps. And then you observe their blood pressure. And then you can just look at the relationships between them or describe differences between different groups of people engaging in different physical activity levels, but you never actually implement an intervention. Whereas in an experiment, instead, you might actually recruit participants and then you might give them a physical activity intervention or not, and then measure the effects of actually intervening on those participants. The benefit of an experimental study is that we can try better to control potential confounders on the outcome that we're interested in, whereas in an observational study there is always the potential for confounders to impact our ability to draw causal inferences about the effects of a given intervention if our observational study is looking at such a thing. Anyway, let's break down the different kinds of observational studies that you can potentially choose to do. As I said, observational studies are either interested in describing, or they're interested in looking at relationships, or they're interested in looking at differences typically. So we can start off with the qualitative study that you could potentially select, and that would be to conduct semi-structured interviews. So within a qualitative semi-structured interview study, what you'll be doing is asking participants about their thoughts, feelings, beliefs, experiences, and so on regarding the topic that you're interested in asking your research question about. So depending upon what the research question is, you may find it appropriate to use a qualitative semi-structured interview study. So it may be that you're interested in athletes' experiences after returning to play from an injury. Now, you could do, for example, a survey and collect data via those means, but you might feel that you will get more interesting information and more salient and valuable information from actually conducting a semi-structured interview with the participants, where you can dig a little deeper, follow up with further questioning, and try to really tease out interesting information from your participants to try and describe those kinds of experiences that they've had. Now, I should note that although in the study designs that you can select, the qualitative semi-structured interview approach falls under the observational studies, that is not to say that you can't technically do a qualitative experimental study, but they're very difficult to do. And I've also included some lectures that were recorded for last year's module where I discussed some of the false dichotomies between qualitative and quantitative research, and one of them is that qualitative research is merely observational and quantitative research is primarily experimental. It's not a strict dichotomy, although it tends to be the case that most qualitative research is descriptive and observational. Now, we have three kinds of quantitative project that you could select under the observational grouping. You could choose to do a correlational study. Now, with a correlational study, what we do is we're typically looking at two or potentially more quantitative variables that you can measure, and then looking at the relationships between those variables, seeing if there's a positive relationship or a negative relationship or no relationship, or maybe even some kind of nonlinear relationship. But what we're doing is we're looking at how, as one of those variables seems to vary, the other seems to vary as well. Now remember, this is just looking at relationships, not necessarily looking at causes. There are technical ways of trying to tease out causes from it, but if you choose to do this kind of project in this context, you'll mostly be looking to describe relationships and interpret them carefully as such. We also have what's called a single sample quantitative study. Now, in a single sample project, typically what we have is maybe some kind of population reference value that we're interested in taking a single group of participants and collecting data about them and then comparing that data to that reference value to see whether or not the group differs, the sample differs from it. So one might be to say, what are the normative values? What's the mean value for a particular variable in the population? And then you may wish to look at a particular subgroup and then collect data on them and compare it statistically to that reference value to see if they differ from it. So in a single sample study, we're typically looking at a difference, but a difference with a reference value, not necessarily differences between groups that we've actually collected data on ourselves. A good example of this is a couple of students in recent years have been interested in looking at dietary interventions, or dietary intake, and comparing to see whether or not people are actually meeting the RDA requirements for certain either macro or micronutrients. And so they collected observations, got them to complete food diaries, and then in that single sample they compared it to those reference values to see whether or not they were actually meeting them or not. The last observational study design we have follows on from this, but instead it starts to incorporate multiple samples. So it may be that you've got varying groups in which you can split the population you've sampled into. So it may be males or females, or it may be older, younger, it may be athletes in different sports. But you may wish to draw comparisons between those groups, look at the differences between them or the similarities in a quantitative variable that you've observed in them. So these are the observational studies you can do. Remember, these are studies where you are trying to describe, look at relationships, or look at differences between samples that you collected data on. Lastly, we have experimental, and within the experimental we have two kinds. We have the quantitative parallel sample that you can do, and this is what we would call the classic randomized control trial, where we take apologies, I didn't realise that would jump up so quick, but the quantitative parallel samples is the typical randomized control design, where we have a group of individuals that we recruit into our study, and then we randomly split them into two groups We collect some data on them, implement an intervention and a control in one or some other intervention, and then we follow them up later to see whether or not there has been an effect of the intervention. But we can also do what's called a crossover study, depending upon the nature of the type of intervention we're looking at, where instead we recruit a sample and then they are randomly allocated into one of two treatment orders. And so they do both treatments, but they do one after the other. And that way we can compare the treatment's effect on within the same individuals. So, there are a number of study designs here, and depending upon the research question you're posing, one may be more or less appropriate than another. You need to think about this week, speak to your supervisors about this, book in a tutorial with myself if you're struggling to think through it, and try to figure out what's going to be the appropriate study design that I'll need to use in order to actually conduct and set up my study.